Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Stop Shitting on Yourself. I am Jessica.
And I'm Jamie. How's your week been, Jessica?
I mean, it's good. As you can tell by the fresh new haircut.
I see it. It looks nice.
Thank you. Well, for those of you guys who are just listening to the audio podcast, I did get a haircut. I feel like I've had the same haircut for like 5 years now. So I just needed a change. Yeah.
It's a lot shorter.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's dyed too, right? The color looks a little bit different.
It is. It's like a brown. So I didn't go like super crazy or anything, but it is a very big departure from what I know.
Yeah, and it's like super ready for the fall.
Mm.
So it looks nice.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, ready for the sweaters, the turtlenecks, just being warm.
Which is gonna happen soon in Southern California, and hopefully it happens within the next like few weeks because I know it's been kind of warm. So hopefully it really cools down soon because like cuffing season is officially in session, and now that Jessica knows what it is,
yes,
right, we're on the same page here. We know what it is. But it's officially in season now, so the weather's just got to catch up. But also I was thinking because many more people might be getting into, relationships or whatnot. I did want to ask you, what were some of the top lessons that you learned from your past relationships so that maybe those who are starting to get into new relationships can get some advice? You know what I mean?
Okay. I don't know that, again, like I don't know that I'm qualified to give advice.
Okay.
But there are definitely like lessons that I've learned or like things that I've learned, whether it's like about myself or about other people,
Yeah.
that has sort of reshape how I go about, like into relationships or dealing with people in general. I feel like the biggest one, and I've definitely talked about this in the past, but I am not a confrontational person. I don't like, I do feel like a lot of people aren't great at like conflicts in general, but I hate saying no. I feel like it's a lot easier to like say yes and do something I don't like than for me to say no to someone. Like I'm that type of person. As I've gotten older, I've learned that like sometimes saying no is okay. And I feel like the biggest thing, or one of the biggest things I've learned, is it's healthy and very much okay to confront problems. Especially if it's a reoccurring problem.
Yeah.
It's much easier to confront the problem like at the start and talk about it than, just let it slide. And, maybe it's like a small problem, but eventually it will build up to these like larger problems. So I feel like that's one of the things I had to learn, and I had to force myself to really be okay with confrontation.
True. You know what? That's a really good advice because a confrontation's scary just because depending on, your past experiences with people and relationships and all of that, there's that fear of like, well, what if I say this and the person reacts in a negative way and they might leave the relationship or whatnot. And I mean, we can go into like different attachment styles and all of that, but that has to do with us becoming very anxious about, the other person reacting negatively and potentially affecting the relationship in a way that we don't want it to. And so I think that's why a lot of people do shy away from confrontation.
Yeah.
And it could also just be, within their nature to not, I guess address different problems if they feel like they can stick through it. But you're right. I think that is definitely something that I think many of us need to learn and practice because depending on what the topic is, it can be very hard to confront that person.
True. And, I think confrontation, maybe the word itself is kind of scary, right? It doesn't have to be like
spooky.
Scary confrontation, right?
Yeah.
I feel like when people hear confrontation, they think like, oh, you're yelling at each other or, you're like putting it all out there. I don't think it has to be that way. It could be just a very calm kind of confrontation of you just telling each other what's wrong, how it made you feel. Like that to me is confrontation also. It is sort of putting it out there, but not in like an overly aggressive way. And, I think you can also have confrontations after it has happened. it doesn't have to be like the heat of the moment. If anything, I would actually recommend having that conversation after the heat of the moment, like after the heat has died down, after you're not yelling at each other anymore, like,
Uh-huh.
like a I guess a resolution confrontation type of thing where like you're going
Yeah.
in both with the mindset of like I'm going to solve something and I'm going to talk it out, then just yelling at each other.
I mean, yes, and I think that I definitely agree with you in terms of try to let it cool down before you do confront whatever, I guess, issue that you're trying to resolve, right?
Mhm.
However, that's not always realistically the case
It's
because
true.
as you and I know, like, in relationships, emotions do get involved and you get heated and sometimes you yell and you fight.
Yeah.
And that's the realistic ugly side of relationships where it does happen, but you're right. I think there needs to be like another moment where you come back again and kind of process all of that and
Yeah.
talk it out with each other, which I think going back to what you said about, having this calm and more like collected conversation about whatever
Mhm.
you want to confront, I think that has to do a lot with how you handle your emotions. And I've learned from my past experiences that, um, how do I say this? That emotional intelligence isn't always emotional maturity.
Ooh.
And I've been in that position too, where I thought I was like super in touch with my emotions, which, does have to do with emotional intelligence. You can
Mhm.
identify and pinpoint exactly how you feel, what made you feel that way.
Yeah.
And you can articulate it, you can talk about it, and you're not shy about expressing that.
Mhm,
That's
mhm.
emotional intelligence. But do not be fooled. Do
Yeah.
not be fooled, right? Because many times I'd be having conversations with people and I'm like, wow, you're so emotionally intelligent. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Like we can totally, have a relationship. And then you come to find out they're not emotionally mature. They don't know how to process those emotions.
Yes.
They don't
Yeah.
know how to deal and react to those emotions. And so I think part of what you were saying when it comes to like a calm or collected kind of confrontation has to do with whether the person is emotionally mature or not. And I think that's something that
Mm.
I've had to learn to do and kind of identify within myself. But
Mhm.
because I've been able to do that, I've been able to kind of spot out those who are
Yeah.
not emotionally mature, yet emotionally intelligent.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, they can talk the talk, but not walk the walk.
Exactly, exactly. And that to me is kind of, I mean, I know everyone's like working on that, but at the
Yeah.
same time, it is difficult because when a person understands that they can identify their emotions,
Mhm.
sometimes people confuse it with being emotionally mature.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, but I can do this. And so I feel like, I'm trying to confront my problems to them, but they're not
Mhm.
understanding, blah blah blah. But it's like, well,
Yeah.
actually, how are you also reacting to those emotions that do matter?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like some people can give like perfectly mature advice
Mm,
and still not actually like be able to do that when they're put in that same, environment or whatnot.
right.
And it's hard. I feel like to be emotionally mature, it's like a next level of things. Like you have to have gone through certain things, you have to have learned certain things about yourself.
Hmm.
And then you have to be able to kind of like take that in and figure out how it applies to you, to be emotionally mature. So I feel like, when you're just freshly out of a relationship when you're 16, like it's
Hmm.
hard to be emotionally mature or expect, the other person to be emotionally mature. Like you have to have
Right.
gone through it and you have to put in the work to be emotionally mature.
Yeah. And I think there are steps, right? Like the first step is to identify, right? You
Yeah.
have to be able to identify and articulate, put words to how you feel and what you're thinking. But that next step is like processing and also kind of taking that step back and having the self reflective moment of,
Mhm.
wait, hold on, hold on, I'm feeling this way. How am I reacting right now? Right. And
Mhm.
how is that
Mhm.
affecting me and my partner, which is, I think, the maturity part. And that takes practice and it takes,
Yeah.
actually, I would say it takes constant practice. It's like
Mhm.
you're not just mature and you're there and you're done. It's a constant like reflection of, your reactions and how that's affecting other people.
Mhm.
It's a constant practice type of thing.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's also not second nature because a
Right.
lot of times we tend to just fend for ourselves, like as humans, right? You see a problem and you kind of run, or you see something coming at you and you run, right? So I feel
Mm-hmm.
like that's like the fight or flight, like natural instincts. And for kind of like emotional maturity to happen, for it to happen with two people,
Uh-huh.
or between two people, it has to be like a learned and practice type of thing. It's not something that comes come to you right away.
No, I don't think anything comes to you, especially with emotional maturity. You have to want it and you have to work for it. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's something that like is more of an active practice as opposed to
Yeah.
something that's passive and it comes to you. It doesn't. You can have all the different experiences in your life, but
Right.
if you yourself do not self-reflect and take the initiative to do that and you're not
Hmm.
active about it, you're never going to gain that emotional maturity.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, it doesn't come with age either. Like, just because we're
No.
saying it will take time, it doesn't automatically come
No.
with age either.
Absolutely not. It does not. And that's one thing that, I think people need to keep in mind that just
Yeah.
because somebody is older doesn't mean that they're always
Hmm.
emotionally mature or intelligent.
Yeah, 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 yeah. That's why it's like, it's funny, like, looking back now, we're always like, oh, I want to find guys who are older than me because
Right.
they'll be so much more mature. Like, yes, they might be like mature by age, but by no means does that equal emotional maturity.
Right. Because that's like you investing time in yourself to understand yourself. And that's like, not everyone does that, even if you grow older.
Speaking of that, speaking of like emotional maturity, speaking of like be able to think not only for yourself and for the couple, basically, you're thinking for each
Hmm.
other. One of the things that I had to learn, and we kind of talked about this a little bit too, is that like not everyone wants to be loved the same way. Right.
Oh,
We've
so
talked
true.
about, the five love languages before.
Right.
But it's really hard because, like how you want to receive love.
Hmm.
But the other person, even if you might have the same thoughts and feelings about things, even if you have the same ideologies, like you might be very compatible and
Hmm.
still not want to receive love the same way. And
True.
I feel like that's the difference between like a loving relationship and a very like mature relationship, right? Emotionally mature relationship is when you know how each other want to be loved, and it might not be your love language, but you know
Okay.
how the other person wants to be loved,
Hmm.
and you act based on how they want to be loved rather than how
Hmm.
you want to receive love.
No, absolutely. Because if the type of things that you're doing to show your love isn't being translated to the person that you're giving your love to,
Hmm.
because that's not how they receive love,
Yeah.
then there's so much like miscommunication going on, like you're going to feel a certain type of way because you feel like you're putting in so much effort and yet they don't
Hmm.
notice, but they
Yeah.
feel like, oh, why don't they do this for me or show that they love me? And
Hmm.
so there's just going to be a lot of like misunderstanding and miscommunication going on.
Hmm.
So definitely that is something super important,
Hmm.
that not everyone wants to be loved the same way that you want to be loved. And I think that's something we got to keep in mind.
Mhm. Yeah, and it is hard. Like, it is something that, like, off the bat, when you first get into a fresh relationship, you might not know that, right? Like, I feel like it takes a
Yeah.
lot of trial and error and figure out, like, oh, like, just because I like gifts doesn't mean, my partner likes gifting, So I may
Right.
be buying my partner a bunch of stuff and then they're not receiving it the same way that I would. Things like
Yeah.
that, where it is a little bit of trial and error. And I also feel like you may think you know what your love language is, but it could also vary from person to person as well.
True. And from time to time.
Yeah, exactly. It is, I feel like an ever changing, evolving thing, even
Mhm.
ourselves, right? As we're changing, our love language
Yeah.
is changing. And so
Right.
I mean, there's no fast, hard rule on love, as we've talked about.
Yeah.
Um and it's all just about learning each other. I think that's important.
That's true. And I think a lot has to do with knowing yourself and reflecting on yourself too. Like you do need to be
Mm-hmm.
really self-reflective when you get into a relationship
Yeah.
because because not just for your own sake, but also
Mm,
for the relationship's sake, right?
yeah.
Like, so in order to even understand how the other person wants to be loved, you have to understand yourself, right? And so I feel like there's a lot of self-reflection that goes on before you get, or I guess when you're in a relationship or even before you
Yeah.
get into it. But I think one that like kind of goes hand in hand with that is to really understand like where you stand in the relationship and to understand that,
Ooh.
yeah, because I feel like when a lot of people do get into relationships, and maybe it could be like a maternal instinct when it comes to women, it could just be
Mm.
like, your past experiences as a child to in, the environment that you grew up in. It could be so many things for whatever reason, right?
Mhm.
But I think a lot of times when we get into relationships, we kind of, and I say we, I should probably say I, and maybe you, I don't know,
Okay.
right?
Mm.
I feel like people sometimes get into this like fixer mentality.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And you might hear this a lot where people say, you can't fix everything. You can't fix that person. It's just
Mhm,
them.
mhm.
Okay. Like you can't fix them. So just let it be.
Right.
And when you hear that, you're almost kind of like, I feel like people kind of are defensive about it. They're like, no, 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 I'm not a fixer though.
Mhm.
But a lot of people fall into and get into this fixer mentality where they they try to be understanding of the partner, and that's part of being in a relationship, right? Like to
Mhm.
understand and reflect and talk and communicate or whatnot. But then in that moment of trying to understand your partner, sometimes we do and we are guilty of like giving them too many excuses or too many chances because we're
Mhm.
like, okay, look, we talked about it with them. So maybe they'll, like fix it. Maybe they'll
Mhm,
change a
mhm.
little bit. Maybe they'll
Yeah.
understand my viewpoints or whatever, right? Certain things you just kind of do have to let go. You do have to compromise. But at the
Right.
same time, like there are certain things that you do have to stand your ground on.
Mhm.
And I think what happens with a lot of people is you have those conversations and you feel like that person's going to change, but they don't. And you're almost waiting for that potential of change to happen. And I think
Mm.
that's when you're in that fixer mentality, right?
Yeah.
Like you're not there to fix somebody to be a better version of themselves. So you can get there if they're willing to do that too, but you're not
Mhm.
there to wait until they get there. You know what I mean?
Right.
I don't know if I'm saying this right, but
No, I hear you because I feel like, and I've done this in the past certainly, and I feel like I've
mhm,
seen a lot of my friends do it, and maybe we can call it like fixer mentality, maternal instinct, whatever it is. But I think it's almost like our own way of trying to figure out what's wrong and trying to take control of a problem. Because
mm,
a lot of times, maybe in the beginning of the relationship, right? Everybody puts their best foot forward and
right.
it's great, right? You don't have a lot of confrontation, or maybe, you just end up being the best that you can be. Over
Mhm,
time, obviously some of those things that again doesn't necessarily come second nature, you'll
right.
revert back to some of those like older practices or
Yeah.
things that just might not be exactly like how you would be in the beginning of a relationship. And I
Mhm,
feel like that's normal, right?
right.
Um, but a lot of times people will then after a while wonder like what happened, what changed, like what is it exactly that that changed, or like maybe I've talked to him about it, how come he's not reacting the way that I want him to? Is it because something that
Mm,
I did? Is it because it's something that I can do to maybe help the situation? Is it
mhm,
potentially something that I've done differently that maybe I can change to maybe help the other person revert back to their old self? So I think a lot of times when things
mm,
don't, go your way, it's almost like maybe it's something that I'm doing. Maybe if I change this, then my partner will go back to acting like how they used to. I feel like it's kind of our natural instinct of trying to fix something when you don't see it kind of reciprocated by the other person. And
mhm.
we sometimes have to tell ourselves like sometimes it just is. Like it's not because you've
Yeah.
done something, it's not because your partner's done something. It's just that's how the situation is, and you can't really fix that
Yeah.
necessarily. And I think it's just hard for us to be like, well, okay, there's nothing I can do. you know,
Yeah, that's true.
yeah, I feel like that's like the last resort, right? It's like, okay, there's nothing I can do, so we have to break up. But no one wants to resort to that immediately. So they want to fix things.
Yeah, and I think like I mean with what you said it's 100% true, but obviously it's a very case by case scenario. Like we're not telling you that, if your partner doesn't do anything and if they keep repeating the same pattern to freaking quit it, right? We're not saying
Right, right.
that, but at the same time like it's more of like a use your own judgment. Like if you are telling your partner, hey, you know what, you disrespected me at dinner time when you called me out for doing A, B, C, and D, when we could have had
Mhm.
the conversation in private. Next time I would, much prefer that this happens in private. And they're like, oh, okay, cool. Right. But they keep repeating the same thing over and over again. And it's already happened a few times. And it's like, okay, look, like there's only so much you can do. Right. Maybe they're just that type of person where
Mhm.
they use like shame, or they, I don't know, public shame to like try to
Yeah.
fix you. And you don't like that. And they don't understand that that's disrespect. Okay, cool. You talked about it a few times, then move the on, right? Like they're
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
disrespecting you. Why put yourself in that position where you're waiting for that person to understand what respect is
Mm.
because you think that they're a good person, they're going to understand one day? Right. Like,
Yeah.
I think that's the type of fixer mentality that I'm talking about and that I'm trying to refer to, because with what you said, it could be put into another scenario where it's like, okay, maybe the person has like mental health issues and you're trying to like support them along their
Mm,
journey.
mhm,
And
mhm.
they're also seeking the help and they're also being active in, you know, in, I guess, like their own mental health journey as well. Right.
Yeah.
So if
Yeah.
that's the case and you see the other person trying and putting in that effort, even if it's slow progress, they're putting in effort. So
Mhm.
that's the case where I'm like, look, like you're helping them, you're supporting them. That's not a fixer mentality per se. And both of you are working on that goal together and they're being proactive in their own self. So that's
Right.
great, right?
Mhm.
But the other scenario where they're not respecting you or they're continuing to do things that are like demeaning towards you or just like
Yeah.
not respectful towards you as a partner, then you don't need to fix that. That's just it's just
Right.
what it is. Like that's just who
Right. Right.
they are. So just leave it.
Yeah. And I feel like you do have to make that differentiation. Like one on the one hand, it's if you guys are both working towards something and you see progress, then that's fine, right?
Mhm.
But
Right.
I think what you're talking about is if it's like very one-sided. If
Mhm.
you're pushing for change, if you're pushing for, like whether it's changed for the better or you're just changing yourself, if it's
Mhm.
one-sided, then that's kind of that like fixer mentality or maybe that like toxic fixer mentality that we're trying to get away from. It's that like you
Right.
can't change everything, especially when the other person isn't putting in equal amount of effort to try to change that
Right.
situation.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely sums it up. Thank you.
I mean, relationships are hard, and I feel like
Oh
even with
yeah.
all like everything that we talked about today, like we're still trying to like implement these things in our day to day, whether it's with like a romantic relationship or
Mm.
just with like friends and family. Like it's ever changing, and I also feel like a lot of these like quote unquote lessons learned. It's also
Mhm.
it varies between the person as well. So you may sort of learn
Mhm.
a lesson, but when you get into another relationship or even with someone else, it's not applicable to that person like to the T, right? It's like it's still
Right.
changing, it's still different. And it's tough, but it's all about like that journey of learning each other and figuring out what works for you guys and seeing if you guys want to make it work.
Yeah, that's very true, right? So with cuffing season in season,
Yes.
when you find your new partner, try to test out the waters.
Mhm.
But also keep this in mind too, that there are, different things that you should definitely look out for and keep in
Mhm.
mind
Mhm.
as you, kind of enter into this new relationship that
New
hopefully sparks
relationship.
into something further.
Or apparently not, right? Because cuffing season is what, like a few months?
I mean, yeah, but it could lead to something
It could lead to
greater.
something. Yes.
It could, not
Yes.
always, but it could. It
Yeah. Yeah.
could. Yeah.
And if anything, maybe you'll just find like a cuddle buddy for a few months,
Oh
right?
yeah, like hibernate together
Yeah.
because it's
Yeah.
gonna be our quote unquote winter.
Yeah. Well, maybe not so much in Southern California, but like everywhere else that has a season. Yes.
True. You know what? Blast the AC. You'll feel like, you need to cozy up and, just cuddle and hibernate together in your AC'd out apartment or house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as always, please let us know what other, top lessons you've learned from past relationships, how you've grown from them, and how's cuffing season going in general. Let us know.
I guess so. Yeah. Spill the tea.
Spill the tea. Give us all the juicy details.
Well, until then, we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.